Well, let's stick to the shadows. Or not. A bit more of a warrior game this one is. We're here with Shadow Warrior 3, and, well, let me try and catch you up. If you're not familiar with the Shadow Warriors series, they're very not serious. It has this kind of laugh about every little aspect. It's very self-aware, and, well, there's not much shadow. It's just about 100% just grueling combat. So stealth is out the window. That is not what this game is about. You're going to go through, crush a lot more demons, and follow this giant Asian dragon. What did you think about the combat? Because that's the main focus here.
Very much, I was going to say Doom. Because even though it's Shadow Warrior, and I was expecting a bit more sword action, it is fun. It's a really lot of fun. I do like the graphic style, but it wasn't perfect. I found it wasn't as polished as I would liked it to be. I found some bits were glitchy. I had an issue where I was changing a weapon, and when I come out from it, I had no weapon in my hand, and it kind of froze like that.
I had a few of those issues as well, so I'm not quite sure if there's a lot of updates coming in, maybe some patches that'll fix these issues, but they weren't necessarily game-breaking. I had the very similar experience where I go in and out of the pause menu and the entire game is frozen. That was a little frustrating, but I was able to unstick it just by pausing a bunch of times. I did have an issue with the final boss fight. Now, I'm not really going to get into spoilers here. It's not much of a surprise. You shoot this one to death, but it had this kind of motion to it where it jumps up in the air, and when it came back down, it would land on what looks like an invisible plateau above me. I wasn't able to shoot any of the weak points. I couldn't advance the fight at all. It just kind of stood there, laughing at me. Luckily for myself, it is a Doom-lite, is what I would call it. Instead of roguelite, it's a Doom-lite. You're moving around at light speed. You have a little bit of a dash. You have a double jump. You have this melee weapon. That's a little bit new, but the different arsenal of weapons just keep getting stronger and stronger, more gruesome as time goes on, and you're crushing hundreds of enemies. Literally hundreds of enemies. You can acquire some of these upgrade tokens, and that'll build your character up, give you a little bit more survivability, or boost up your weapons. So it gives you a little bit to work on in the long run, but in the short term, you're just a death machine. I really like that kind of a shooter, and this was almost made for me in that respect. Now, the visuals, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it does look a little bit dated. It sort of gives me that Borderlands feeling, where it's not quite a comic book, but it's just kind of low res, but really bright look to the environment, to the enemies. So there's a little bit lacking in that regard. But the audio has very good voice acting. I enjoy the voice acting, and I think they work really well. Different personalities expressed, but man, was I so tired of all those one-liners. It was so awful. Eventually, you're hearing the same kind of things over and over again. That gets really annoying, but it was clever in some regards. There's a lot of
It breaks it up a little bit.
Yeah, so, it knows it's not serious. It's being very not serious, and I like that, because it would have been awkward if it kind of broke that halfway through. But there's so many different pop culture references. Whether the guy says, hasta la vista, or I'll be back, or there's just a bunch. There's probably dozens of those written in. And those were, again, I like it, but it gets a little repetitive.
I did like the character of Lo Wang. I found him quite comical, does what he wants to do, and just wants to blast things up. And like you said, you do go to the areas, or arenas, sorry. And then what you do is you start off with the basic horde of enemies, you just blast away, and then when you move to the next one, you get the same one again, but they just give you a different enemy with a higher ability or harder to shoot. And then they just keep adding and adding. So as you progress through, they just keep adding an extra horde of enemies. But I do like the way they did split it up in some scenes where you actually have to precisionally jump between different platforms. Right across the walls, and even use your grapple hook to swing to certain areas. but it's on a time. It's not a time challenge, but you've got limited time to get jump from platform to platform before they either disintegrate or fall. And if you mess it up, then you have to start that bit again. And even when you get to you think you got to the end, they'll add an extra bit onto it. And if you die there, then you have to start back at that beginning again. So
sometimes
I did
they
find
go
that frustrating.
quite long. Yeah. Well, there's
I found
the
it
one
frustrating.
that little ice piece that you follow down what seems to be the world's longest mountain. That went on a little bit long, but it's funny because it's a very Doom similar kind of experience. In Doom Eternal, there's a lot of this kind of platforming, using your dash, your double jump to cross big open spaces. So it's interesting how they took a little bit here and a little bit there off of Doom and what it's done successfully, and they've made it kind of their own thing, not taking it seriously, having this kind of wacky story, lots of magic, witchcraft going on. You're fighting the different yokai, demons, and it has its own identity, but it fits into that little shooter subgenre that I really, really enjoy. Thank you for Doom for putting that one in my head. If you're going to score this one up, what do you think this one deserves?
Well, I did have a lot of fun. I did complete it in about 11 hours, but I wasn't on the hard mode, I was on the medium. And I didn't like the way that when I completed it, that I couldn't go back and replay the levels.
Yeah.
And for that, I'm giving this one a 7. How about you?
Okay, I think that's fair. That little bit of, you almost have to start a new game plus, but it's not worked into the game that way. That's a little frustrating, but when it comes to the meat and potatoes of this game, the real combat, the crushing brutality, those execution kills, it has all the right pieces that I really enjoy from that specific subgenre of shooter. We'll call it a Doom-lite. I really appreciated the aspects it brings, and it has enough of a personality to stand on its own. I'm not such a fan of that traversal kind of platforming, but it is useful to break up the game otherwise and to reach that 9-hour game time. I think that's where I was about on hard mode. So there's not a huge amount of game here, but what it is, it does really well. I really appreciate this game. I'm there with a 7.5. There's a little bit of some glitching, some bugging, but everything else just stands well on its own. Shadow Warrior 3 is a brutal Doom-like shooter with a unique sense of humor. It is held back by bugs and glitches.